Press the bell icon on YouTube and don't miss another update.
Hi, welcome to a new edition of Elonomics. $5 trillion is the new buzzword. Last week, Prime Minister Narendra Modi told chief ministers of states that he wants the Indian economy, the Indian GDP, to touch $5 trillion by the time he returns for re-election in 2024. $5 trillion is not a small amount. Right now, the size of the Indian economy is about 2.8 trillion, which means we have to almost double from 2.8 to 5 in 5 years. Modi also said that it's a challenging task but achievable. A lot of such targets are made and given to the country. It's good to have ambitious targets. Indian economy needs to grow, but is it really possible doubling the size of our economy in 5 years, especially considering the slowdown and the problems we face, the headwinds, the global challenges, the domestic challenges? To discuss that and more, I have with me Professor Ila Patnaik, and we'll start talking to her about this possibility. Hi Ila. So it's a $5 trillion question. Is it possible?
Well, what you really need is to have the entire energy of the economy, of the people, to be producing, to be involved in activity, and that's what can give you very high growth rates. So 5 trillion means doubling in 5 years. Normally, if you're growing at 7%, you double in 10 years. So this is really asking for a lot. But, if everybody is engaged, productivity goes up, one could try to grow as fast as possible. But that means just about everybody across the economy gets engaged in productive activity.
Is that happening at this point in time, Ila? Everybody being engaged?
See, one of the big problems that we are facing now is that the energy that is there in the country, that people who've learned something, who are educated, who want to start businesses, don't have adequate access to credit. So this is not a new problem. It's been there for 70 years. Various government schemes have come up. You've got this Mudra, you've got many other schemes trying to do financial inclusion, getting access to credit to small entrepreneurs who want to do some business. If one is able to do that, then actually that's not just for jobs, but it's very, very critical for growth, because growth comes from small enterprises. When one man starts and it becomes a 5-person enterprise, he grows really fast. It's at that point that enterprises grow fast. When we look at credit availability to them, because they have the labor, what they need is credit. That today is an issue.
So why has this issue not been identified before? Like you said, it's a 70-year-old problem, and MSMEs have been around just like the large blue chip companies, the large corporate firms. So why has the MSME sector not been given the attention you say it deserves?
Actually, the way it was done so far was different. The attempt was to tell banks to do priority sector lending, and banks would go and lend out to small enterprises. But the problem with that was that it was being done after most of the resources of banks were taken away. So you had the statutory liquidity ratio, where banks' portfolio went to government bonds, large corporates, because there's not much of a bond market. So large corporates and the government were both borrowing from banks. Now, banking, which is very well suited to going and looking at a business, figuring out what is its business model, monitoring it, was not really doing that. So this model of everybody, including all the AAA rated and the government, turning to banks rather than to a bond market, because it didn't exist, meant that they were usurping all the resources available. Banks did the minimum that was required. So they were not competing for customers. What you need is a system where the core business of banking is to lend to small businesses. So, our whole financial system and the way the banking system has been, it's not a competitive banking system. I find that 2 bank licenses were given in 10 years. So it's that competition for giving loans out to small businesses, that's missing, and that's not something that we've figured out so far.
On the one hand, you're talking of giving more bank licenses. On the other hand, we keep reading about the government wanting to merge smaller banks into the larger public sector banks. That's contradictory.
Well, you can leave the public sector banks, you can merge them all or not merge them all. They repeatedly, every 10 to 15 years, after making losses for many years, require a fresh injection of capital. Okay. What you might want to do is give new bank licenses. You can give licenses to private banks. There are many in the system who could, we tried this payment bank thing, that hasn't worked. It hasn't given us the financial inclusion and the lending that one might have wanted in the system. So you can give new licenses to private banks. Do what you want to with the public sector. I would say, because they're such a holy cow, we leave them aside, we let them be. One day when you wish to privatize them, you can do that. Until then, every 10 years, put a couple of lakh crores into them, because we seem to be, we seem to have to be living with that. But what I'm talking about is the airline or the aviation or the telecom model, where they didn't really privatize, but they gave licenses to
more and more
private sector.
But do private sector banks, Ila, lend to MSMEs? And you also talk about lending, say, up to 20 lakhs without collateral. Are private banks willing to take that kind of risk?
At the moment, they don't need to. There's such few private banks that system is not there. You can also have NBFCs. You see, today, the way we've developed and our financial system has developed, NBFCs are a very Indian model.
Yep.
Okay?
Shadow banks, as they call them.
They borrow from various sources, and then they lend to small and retail as well. So there are some who lend to infrastructure. We know the ILNFS story. There are others who lend to the housing for housing sector. And then there are those who lend for transport equipment, for white goods, cars. We are seeing the whole auto sector is getting into trouble because NBFCs are not able to lend to them. So that was a model that, unfortunately, that's run into trouble. But if it can be regulated well, if you can get more transparency into it, then if we can get through with the troubles, get the bad guys out, and sort those problems out, then that's another option. Banks plus non-banks that can go out and give loans to small enterprises.
That brings us to the issue of the liquidity crunch. I mean, you talked about NBFCs and the fact that they're not lending anymore. And even if you want banks to lend to the MSME sector, in this liquidity situation, how do you trigger that lending spree, if you want to call it a spree?
So one is, of course, the overall liquidity situation, where RBI has said that we'll be in deficit liquidity. So one is to increase that. But that may not answer.
How do you do that?
All the problems. You can do open market operations. So RBI can do open market operations. It's been doing that. That's not an issue. But what NBFCs seem to be wanting is that banks lend more to NBFCs. Now the problem there is that, so what they are saying is that even if there is liquidity in the system, we may not get it because banks will not lend to us. Either they've reached their exposure limits to NBFCs, or because, and rightly so, banks think that it's risky. And if the NBFC does not have good assets, then banks will not lend to that NBFC. So it is not obvious that this liquidity situation, which you hear being talked about all the time, even if it's eased, is going to go to the bad guys. Because there are today two sets of NBFCs. There are the good ones and the bad ones. So it may not go to those who have weak assets.
Can we talk about some of these programs that were launched recently? One was Mudra, which you also talk about in your latest piece. Also towards I think the end of last year, when the whole MSME crisis was being talked about, the government came up with something called loan in 59 minutes, or approving a loan in 59 minutes. So how successful have these been?
See, there's a SIDBI report that said that there are about 50 million small enterprises in the country, out of which 5 million get bank loans. Okay, so when you are talking about trying to reach the rest of the 45 million, and by now there will be more, it's an old report, then you really have to try everything under the sun. Okay, so what was tried, I think, was something that could be done immediately. You know, you've got these banks, you tell them it's targeted. I mean, it's like it's mandated that they have to give small loans. I think the one good thing that was done was that earlier, because small loans fall under priority sector lending. So earlier what would happen is that the bank wouldn't want to do too much because its target for next year for priority sector lending depended on how much it lent this year. And these would be loss making for them because the interest on the loan is fixed. So what did they do in the Mudra scheme was they started this Mudra bank and they gave interest subvention. So with interest subvention, it became profitable for the bank to maybe not very profitable, but at least less loss making. I don't know the full details. Less loss making for the bank to lend. But even there, you know, the demand is huge. And what has been done, while it's good and it's in the right direction, but what you really need is to unleash much more of those who want to go out and give loans to them. So whether it is healthy NBFCs who go out and try to reach out to the last mile, or whether it is small banks who are competitive, who are looking for that, you know, customer who wants to borrow.
How do you see, because bad loans and NPAs are you know, the talk of town for last couple of years. How do you deal with bad loans in the MSME sector? How bad are they, in fact, you know, compared to, say, the priority sector or the large corporates?
See, at the moment, that's not where the bulk of the problem is. I cannot say that they will all repay their loans, but NBFCs also, it was not the small borrowers who were the problem. Mainly things went bad with the real estate companies or with ILNFS. So it was housing finance or large infrastructure companies where the problems happened, not really the small borrowers.
So what would be, according to you, a signal from the financial sector or from even the government that would say that, yes, okay, now we are going to address the funding financial needs of the MSME? What would be that signal?
So I think that it will not, it might be just a direct signal where they tell more people to lend, but what will solve the problem in the longer run is to get both the government and the large corporates, the AAA rated, the AA rated, out of banks into the bond markets, for which you need bond market reforms. So it seems indirect that when you ask me how do you address financing to MSMEs, and my answer is a bond market, because the bond market is for the large borrowers.
Which takes care of the large borrowers.
Yeah, but you really need to get them out, because otherwise banks are very comfortable just lending to these people. And secondly, give more bank licenses. You know, you can have a resolution corporation which takes care when banks fail, but you give out more licenses and create a competitive environment, but a better regulated environment. So my top priority would be the PDMA bill, that is setting up your to develop a bond market. Second would be the FRDI bill, and both these bills had been tabled in Parliament in the last Parliament, and they need to be amended and brought back on the table.
Let's hope the Parliament session, which is currently ongoing, the monsoon session, takes up some of these critical issues and addresses them, so that the MSME sector can get some of the critical funding the sector needs. Thanks, Ila, and we'll be back soon for another edition of Ilanomics. Thanks for watching.